Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Jackson Mihm, and I am an associate editor with Global Americans. If this is your first time joining one of our events, Global Americans is a think tank based here in Washington with the goal to provide policymakers, academics, civil society leaders, and Western Hemisphere enthusiasts with the tools needed to promote change and build more prosperous inter-American relations. Last year, in an effort to further collaboration between key U.S. and Caribbean actors, Global Americans assembled policymakers, scholars, government officials, and civil society representatives to form a high-level working group on climate change in the Caribbean. Before we start, I wanted to send a warm thank you and welcome to the Open Society Foundations for their generous support of this initiative. To date, the working group, in conjunction with Global American staff, have published 3 reports with substantive recommendations for key actors in the U.S. as well as the region. One of these reports covers climate finance, and events like these seek to raise awareness on some of the recommendations of our working group. One final thank you to the Global American staff members and working group members, 3 of which joined today, who helped me prepare for this event. Namely, on the Global American side, Guy Mentel, Adam Ratzlaff, Scott McDonald, and Alejandro Trenki. Now, before we begin, I wanted to introduce each of the panelists who will be speaking today. I'm going to start with Marsha Caddle, MP. She is an economist and public policy strategist and is currently serving as the president of the global advisory firm, the Bold Center. Her areas of work include climate finance and sustainable development, public investment, as well as financing for development. From 2018 to 2022, she served as the Minister for Economic Affairs and Investments of Barbados. In 2021, she was the ministerial negotiator on climate finance for the Alliance of Small Island States, introducing the redistributed special drawing rights for scaled-up finance in climate vulnerable nations at the Glasgow Climate Pact of COP26. Dr. Kalim Shah is a professor at the Biden School of Public Policy at the University of Delaware, and also acts as the director of the university's Island Policy Lab. Dr. Shah's research addresses science-based policy and regulatory design for climate change, pollution prevention, clean technology, and sustainable development. Dr. Shah has provided expert advice, research, and analysis for organizations including the World Bank, IDB, UN Development Program, and various Caribbean governments. Jade Tjon is the representative of Suriname at the Inter-American Development Bank, or IDB, where she serves as the focal point between the government of Suriname and the bank. In her work, Ms. Tjon is dedicated to bringing attention to the needs and opportunities in small and island states and advocating for awareness on issues like diversity and inclusion, vulnerable populations, and climate change. She is also the founder of Foreign Exchange, a brand with the mission and vision to advocate and create awareness concerning the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Lisa Viscidi is a senior manager in Deloitte Consulting's government and public services practice, where she provides technical expertise and manages international energy projects in emerging markets for the United States government and various international clients, including USAID and the State Department's Energy Resources Bureau. Ms. Viscidi has led projects and written numerous reports and articles on the decarbonization of the oil and power sectors, energy policy and regulations, and sustainable transport. Anaitee Mills is a seasoned development professional and former climate finance advisor in the Office of the Prime Minister in Jamaica. In her former role, she coordinated and shaped Prime Minister Andrew Holness's high-level agenda during the course of the 2019 United Nations Climate Action Summit. To this day, she continues to oversee the effective in-country implementation and stakeholder engagement of 3 climate action-related initiatives in Jamaica, where she provides advisory services toward accelerated climate action and sustainable development. Anaitee is also the co-founder of ITACA Solutions, ITICA, a technical service provider focused in mobilizing finance, capacity, and expertise for climate change adaptation in coastal areas of the Caribbean. Now, Let's get right into it. As you can see, we have quite the panel, and I'm thrilled to have the chance to welcome and moderate a discussion among these experts. So without any further delay, let's get right into it. Now, Kalim, I was wondering if you could give us a lay of the land. In framing this discussion on climate finance, how would you describe the state of climate action in the Caribbean?
Thanks very much, Jackson. And let me say thanks to you and Global Americans for having me here. And hello to the audience from around the world and the esteemed panel of experts here. So, I mean, we can say again that, the Caribbean region continues to have this significant climate finance gap. And this has historically been so, even compared to other developing country regions, Pacific and other places. There's still this large climate finance gap. Since about 2015 or so, a lot of the most of the climate finance has come through places like the GCF and others. And this amounted to between 2020 2021 about $150 million US. Still just a drop in the bucket, as I'll get to in a little while. Now, the split between, if we wanted to do it, climate adaptation activities projects versus climate mitigation is roughly about 60-40, right? There's a number of multi-focus type activities as well. But again, this sort of speaks to the higher adaptation needs of the region, right? This sort of 60-40 split. Some might even argue that that split should be even more on the adaptation side. That being said, and colleagues here have deep expertise on adaptation. I'll illustrate a couple of points more on the climate finance for mitigation side of things. And the key question here could be framed as, if we have enough financing in the Caribbean to meet the nationally determined contributions of countries that they have declared under the Paris Agreement. What we do have right now in estimation is about 8 or 9 Caribbean countries have cost estimates for mitigation activities, and several others have combined costs estimates across adaptation, resilience building, and mitigation. But a good rule of thumb sort of estimate that we can keep in mind is about $50 billion US across the entire Caribbean region to meet what is declared in the NDCs. And the majority of activities identified in the NDCs are conditional on provision of international climate finance. Disbursement rates remain very low, as I mentioned, and this obviously speaks to implementation problems, or I shouldn't say problems, challenges that the region still grapples with, right? And we can have this conversation on sort of a multi-level, scaffolded kind of discussion of where those challenges lie: policy and institutional governance levels, regional versus national levels, programmatic, and definitely on the project level. I think other colleagues can speak to as well. But let me say this. I think at the most fundamental level, from a Caribbean perspective, the climate finance, climate mitigation finance challenges lies sort of squarely in understanding and being able to measure, quantify, and justify the risk reward of activities that we would like to see happen under the NDCs, right? And making this risk reward argument regionally and by countries is significant. I'll point out three things. One is, in this risk reward discussion, estimating climate risk linked to financial risk, and then further linked to broader macroeconomic risks and so on. This is essential for both project developers, for national governments, in a global competitive climate finance world where there's simply not enough climate finance. And there really is sort of a competition, unfortunately, for funds right now. But making those risk-reward arguments, I think, are somewhat difficult sometimes in the region for many actors. There's a high degree of uncertainty about climate risks, both on a scientific and technical level, and then sort of translating that into financial and economic risks at all levels, right? And this increases sort of the scope for potential failures, especially when you need multiple investors, multiple project developers to come together where they need to justify outputs. And, from my perspective, I think others can speak to it as well. There's return on investment on projects and programs, but it's not only about dollars and cents in the Caribbean region, right? It is about the, is your investment really going to address optimally what you want it to address, be it returns on investments, be it the GHG reductions, be it the reduction of loss and damage, and so on. Is what you're investing in the best alternative, best option? And sometimes in conditions of uncertainty, this is difficult for project developers and governments to do. A good example is sort of the CARICOM regional energy policy and the CSIRM's roadmap, which was excellent at that point in time, I would say, on a policy level, right? But the dynamics of the situation in the Caribbean, the economic, geopolitical, even the technology, right, is moving so fast that this is almost outdated. All right, not to be critical, but when the regional energy policy was developed, it centered energy security more so than climate resilience and mitigation. Of course, risk reduction was a big part of it, right? But I think sort of now we have to relook at that and sort of flip the script a little bit, and I think that is happening in CARICOM to center climate resilience and then fold in, obviously, the very important energy security issues. Last week, IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, put out a report that did an analysis of where Caribbean national mitigation policy targets are versus the NDCs. And many of us here in this audience know this already. There's a big mismatch. Of course, it's very heterogeneous across the board. But again, if you think about it in terms of investment, right? This lends to some amount of policy uncertainty. If your national targets, the national allocations for projects is different from the NDCs, right? That you've declared. So there's some things that need to be adjusted. I think the second idea of this climate risk reward piece is very difficult for us to look at the aggregate nature of climate risks and then link that to economic risks and geopolitical risks. I think we don't do a great job at doing that. Although these ideas are becoming more and more at the forefront, given what we've gone through recently with the COVID pandemic, and then sort of the global supply chain issues and so on. The third thing I would suggest is that in terms of the climate risk reward propositions, making those propositions, information available to investors is key. And the region still, Ambassador Hart made this point recently as well. We still have sort of a dearth of climate information, data, models, and so on that will help investors make decisions and help project developers to justify projects for funding. Without this, the arguments are very difficult to make. There's some other things that we could talk about with risks, but I'll leave that for now. There's, some of our countries, there's a lot more transition risk, economic transition risks. There's ESG ratings, which is a big part of the conversation now, and so on. But I'll leave it there at this point. Thanks very much, Jackson.
Of course. And thank you so much for making the distinction between adaptation and mitigation measures. I wanted to ask Lisa specifically, Related to adaptation and resilience, what are the challenges?
Yes, thank you, Jackson. And I also want to thank Global Americans for the opportunity to participate in this discussion and in the high-level working group. It's been a real privilege to be a part of these discussions. And I think it's a really important initiative to raise the issue of climate change in the Caribbean on the policy agenda. At Deloitte, we're helping countries access climate finance all over the world. In the Caribbean, I've been working specifically on adaptation and resilience. So I think I wanted to focus my remarks on that. And I would say, I think of the main challenges for adaptation and resilience into sort of falling into four main issues for the Caribbean. One is the global macroeconomic environment currently. Already, Caribbean countries have strained government finances. They have high debt levels, many of them, not all. Several have a default history, and some have low GDP growth. And so now in the current macroeconomic environment where there are high interest rates globally, it makes it that much harder to create a profitable project because you're paying more towards interest. So that's made conditions more difficult to get funding. And then in adaptation, when you try to get finance, it's even harder to attract investment because there isn't a clear revenue stream. You're really just offsetting future problems as opposed to bringing in a clear revenue stream. So it's more difficult to measure the benefits. So it's harder to get finance. I think also just globally, there's less investment in donor funds in adaptation than mitigation. Kalim also referenced this. But to give an example, out of $632 billion committed to climate finance in 2019 and 2020, only 7% went into adaptation. I think that's changing. And as we see more and more effects of climate change, there's definitely a shift toward more adaptation, but it continues to be unequal. Then I think the second challenge is the lack of access to capital for businesses to invest in adaptation and resilience. So it's not just the responsibility of governments, it's also the responsibility of the private sector. But in a lot of cases, banks are not lending to adaptation projects. They often don't know how to design loan projects or design loan products or analyze loan requests for adaptation. And again, this comes back to the issue of measuring the benefits. There's not quite enough ability to forecast climate impacts. The countries don't have enough data on climate impacts so that they can measure the benefits. And that affects the ability to analyze loan requests. And also banks themselves say, we don't have enough demand for adaptation investments. We don't see a pipeline of projects coming to us. So there's kind of a supply and demand gap there. And companies don't often know enough themselves to develop, to create a loan application and to provide the data that's needed. So I think that's a big issue. A third challenge that's huge is insurance. When we're talking about, extreme weather events, insurance is classically, how you pay for recovery. But we don't have tools anymore that can insure against the types of losses that we're seeing in the Caribbean. Insurance premiums are just much too high, both for residential and for commercial customers. So many utilities in the Caribbean are even self-insuring just because premiums are so high. But then that means that they're spending a large chunk of the value of their assets paying for insurance, which is diverting money that they actually need to invest in upgrading their assets like transmission lines, which need further upgrades as a result of climate change effects. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. And new solutions are definitely needed in that area. And then finally, I would say that a couple of challenges kind of fall under the bucket of government capacity. I think there's a lack of government ability and just personnel, just hours and time and specific skill sets that are required to apply for and execute international climate funds. So out of the more than $600 billion figure that I mentioned, only about 83 billion in 2020 was dispersed because in part of the difficulty of applying for funds. And to give an example, Barbados and Antigua and Bermuda are the only Caribbean national governments that have received money from the Green Climate Fund for adaptation. Even though this is a great source of finance, why don't more countries receive it? Well, I think largely because the proposal process is very burdensome for governments. They have, I hear from people working in the governments, they say, we have a small number of people that have the specific expertise required to develop these proposals. We're overstretched. It's difficult to get international funds for adaptation. Again, because you have to prove an avoided impact and you have to have data for your proposal. Without sufficient data, that's also a challenge. And also governments in the region are just overstretched and lacking capacity to implement the funds. So even out of the funds that have been dispersed, a large share haven't been executed. So you need to have, the personnel and the ability to actually, even if you apply for a fund, receive the funds, then you have to execute it. That's also a lot of work. So a lot of it has never been executed. So I think like the governments really need some help to shore up their staff and their abilities in a world where more and more time and money needs to be dedicated to dealing with adaptation. And of course, this is only going to get worse. So that's how I would characterize the main challenges from my point of view. And I'm looking forward to hearing what others think.
No, thank you both for setting the stage. I think the level of detail that you guys provided is really great. And for more on that, I wanted to ask Marsha a more specific question. So in 2009, developed countries committed to mobilizing $100 billion per year by 2020 for climate action in developing countries as part of COP15 in Copenhagen. In 2020, they only provided 83.3 billion of that initial target. And the OECD now expects them to meet the original figure this year. With this failure in mind, and sort of in your experience on high-level climate discussions, how would you describe the current status of negotiations on the international level?
Thanks, Jackson. I'm going to jump right in. I'm just going to say hi to everyone. Thanks for having me here. So the first thing I want to acknowledge is that the action happens beyond climate finance negotiations. And I think reflecting on what both Kalim and Lisa have said, that these formal conversations are where we get commitment, where we set frameworks and agreements, but we have to be able to move beyond, and really the action and the investment around climate happens outside of those rooms every day. And I think that we have to understand that that's where we have to focus a lot of our effort, because when we talk about GCF, we're talking about 3% of the global climate finance targets that we have. So GCF is meant to play a specific role, and there's space there for better access and better execution, as Lisa said. But the question is much larger than that. So even from the beginning, we knew that 100 billion, even annually, would not be enough. A couple years ago, Morgan Stanley put the financing gap at $50 trillion over 30 years, and that's just on the mitigation side alone. So we're talking about issues of scale. And for years, we've been saying we have to get beyond that 100 billion. So the last two COPs, 26 and 27, started to get on the road to the first issue that Lisa raised, which is the global macroeconomic environment in which we are operating. And what we began to put on the table was the fact that we need to figure out where are the financial flows to reach scale. One of the things that has come up recently is the issue of special drawing rights. That came out in the outcome language in Glasgow. IMF special drawing rights, which are a specific reserve asset that can be redistributed to countries that don't need those resources, because those countries don't need balance of payment support, towards countries that can use those resources. So climate vulnerable countries that can use that money. So the IMF launched the Resilience and Sustainability Trust to be able to redirect unused special drawing rights, which every country gets based on their quota, towards developing countries. But the question really is, even with the $45 billion target for the RST, where developed countries are putting money in, what are we talking about when we talk about climate finance and where it's going? So we've talked about adaptation and mitigation. The one point I do want to make in response to Kalim and his wonderful intervention earlier is that while countries in the region have to care about our NDCs, we have to care about our commitments to reduce emissions, our mitigation conversation and our mitigation fight is about global emission reduction. Because the fact is that our contribution to emissions is very small. So while we do have NDCs, and we do have to make sure that we have the resources to execute our NDCs, we have to make sure the world has the resources to execute their NDCs. Because the countries that are the major emitters are the ones that are going to directly impact our health and well-being in the Caribbean. So I mean, Barbados has committed to 70% GHG emission reduction by 2033. That's wonderful to show solidarity with the countries in the region and with the world. But it is the Caribbean's business when it comes to mitigation is to make sure the rest of the world is meeting their emission reduction targets. And so it's about how do we get finance flows so that everyone can reduce their emissions. Specifically to how do we get renewable energy investments in this region. One of the things that we've been saying is that we need to have a private sector that and a banking system understand risk and risk allocation, and how are we able to assess this? I think that the multilateral development banks, and I'm very interested to hear Jade's intervention on this, but I think the multilateral development banks have to send some important signals in that regard. And when we come to discuss later some of the initiatives on the ground today, I think we're going to realize that the entire restructuring of the global financial architecture is necessary for us to meet the scale that we want and for us to get the types of financial flows that we want, because we need different types of flows. Yes, we need to have the traditional kinds of projects that governments lead, that governments execute, but Lisa said it. I don't think that governments in the region will ever meet the scale of staff and human resources to be able to have boots on the ground executing everything. What we need is to provide this space for the private and third sector to do what needs to be done, to be able to execute, making sure that people who live in our countries and in our region, one, are benefiting from the investment in terms of wealth creation, but also are not adversely impacted from the kinds of investments that are being made. So I think that, yes, we've seen the launch of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, and that's a good place to begin in terms of where climate finance action is. I think that some of my colleagues in the region, colleague governments, might say that in order to access those resources, you have to be in an IMF program. And that is, well, we very much applaud the fund for this brave step. We also realize that there's some further space to be made because many countries in the region, you'll appreciate, would not wish to be in an IMF program in order to get access to climate resources. So I think there's a lot of further discussion. There's a lot to be said. Lisa made reference to the issue of insurance. And I think when we talk later about different kinds of instruments that are at our disposal, we'll realize that instruments like first loss insurance and so on, we have to start talking about a bit more. The last kind of overarching point I want to make is that we're not just talking about a quantum of resources, even though this is important. And we're not just talking about financial flows, we're also talking about financial instruments. So we're talking about things like natural disaster clauses in our debt, and how do we get innovative with the kinds of instruments that are available for us to invest in climate resilience. No one has yet mentioned, or we haven't yet started to talk about the issue of loss and damage finance, which I have very strong feelings about. But I think that the whole point of loss and damage finance, apart from the decision that came out of COP27 to establish a fund, is to realize that we have to be able to redirect some of the investments that are being made in fossil fuels towards predictable liquidity for loss and damage. When I say predictable liquidity, what I mean is that in the event of a major disaster, that countries know that there's a pool of resources to which they have access immediately, so that there isn't the further kind of degradation and opportunity cost that goes along with not having the capacity to immediately get engaged in reconstruction. So I caution, and I have done so with my colleagues some of us who are looking at this issue of loss and damage financing, that it's not just a question of having a static fund from which countries will draw, but how do we make sure that we have a facility, a mechanism for which countries have predictable liquidity after a disaster? And I think that we have to start to get very innovative in that regard.
Thank you for bringing up loss and damages. We're going to get into that a little bit later, as well as multilaterals and what they're doing. So hold on for Jade's insight on that. But I wanted to circle back, Marsha, to one of the points that you astutely, and so did Lisa, put on the table. And that was about how a lot of the work on climate finance happens outside of the negotiating room. Now, I wanted to kick it to Anaitee. You have worked on the ground implementing climate finance strategy. How do countries translate top-down agenda items into meaningful action? And really, on the micro level, what are the challenges there?
Well, thank you, Jackson, and thank you, Global Americans, for this invitation. Again, good morning to everyone. I'm in a tough position here following Marsha, Lisa, and Kalim, because I think they said a lot of things that I wanted to say that connect very closely to the micro level. But let me add a couple of things that will enrich, hopefully, the conversation. I indeed was very lucky in 2019 to be part of the team that prepared the participation of Jamaica and Prime Minister Holness in co-leading this discussion about climate finance. That opportunity at the highest political level, something that really opened my eyes is how much our political leaders need to be educated about climate finance constantly. And they need to be updated constantly about the different aspects of climate finance, not only at the strategic level, but also at the implementation level in the communities, in their constituencies. So this participation of Jamaica at the UN, I think it was an excellent opportunity to bring that level of awareness to our politicians, to our Prime Minister, and many others. And also, it shined light into some of these gaps that Dr. Shah already explained, and Lisa as well. But in Jamaica, it gave us the opportunity, and this is the beauty about multilateralism and the United Nations Convention. The Secretary General gave this mandate to Jamaica and kind of forced also Jamaica to step out of a comfort zone and fully get immersed into the discussion about climate finance. And not only that, be also sort of a pilot country to many of these initiatives. So I think that was an excellent outcome of that summit. So in my experience, I have to say that announcing an initiative or a pledge at a UN convention or an international platform is perhaps the easy part. The difficult part and the really challenging part is what you are asking exactly, Jackson. How do we translate these very high-level pledges into tangible action on the ground? And action that can fit, or I will say even use the word survive, the local institutional environment, the local conditions, the local market, the limited capacity in staff and resources. And Lisa alluded to this, very, very clearly, and I couldn't agree more. There's also the challenge of understanding technically what are the aspects that make a project actually financially viable or bankable, as many people will use that word. I don't like it, but it's the reality. International organizations need technically and financial viable projects, and capturing all of that into different types of proposal templates, different requirements, different formats in reasonable timelines. So there is the challenge. And then after all this, then there is the challenge of setting up the right implementation structures, identifying the right project managers, setting up procurement, setting up monitoring, reporting. And so this can all, go back to the funders in their timelines. When Marsha was speaking about the 100 billion goal, and this is something that has been in discussion for many years, at the micro level, especially in the Caribbean, this is channeled through the multilateral development banks. And I'm so happy that Jade is here, as the IDB and the World Bank play such an important role in the implementation of mitigation and adaptation, which is still, and we all know, is very unbalanced, and adaptation finance is mostly made up of public actors, much less of private sector, and this is something that needs to change, definitely. What I can say is that the challenge in the case of adaptation is to make available unprecedented, and I want to say this word again, unprecedented levels of grant and concessional financing through local entities and local non-state actors. We are doomed by our success in the Caribbean of having excellent and very interesting community-based organizations, NGOs, project developers on the ground, municipal corporations, state agencies that have many needs. But let's be honest, many of these organizations will not survive the process of accreditation of GCF, definitely not. So this type of organizations need to be at the forefront of project implementation, because they are the ones that are closer to the people that need it the most. There are simply, and I couldn't agree more with Marsha, there are simply not enough funding mechanisms, special funding windows, and financial vehicles, financial products that are available for smaller organizations to access finance. Another important area to work is to translate high-level outcomes into work, or I would say, is to translate high-level outcomes and is to work in strengthening the market for private and public sector investment in climate resilient infrastructure. Dr. Shah was talking about the need of data, the need of working in multi-layers of identifying and assessing climate risk, and support developing countries and the small island states in attracting investment while dealing with capital flight as climate risk becomes more evident. In Jamaica, coming out of the 2019 Climate Summit, we got a good experience. We joined in the Coalition of Climate Resilient Investment. And by serving as one of the pilot countries, Jamaica has now a tool that helps undertake systemic risk assessment and integrating climate risk into project appraisal, and also providing that type of data that Dr. Shah was talking about that can be integrated into our public management, our public investment management systems. So there is definitely a lot of work to do there. This is something that the private sector needs, and the more we work on data, the more we work on making that data available and having these tools to allow us to take a different approach into risk assessment. It will, I think, will change a lot the game into bringing in more private sector investment. And lastly, I'm wearing today also my Ithaca hat. And I have to recognize that there is a very important technical gap between international funds or funders and local entities when it comes to navigating these complex funding requirements of funds. And this gap can be effectively filled by more private sector firms, more consultancies, more technical, specialized technical service providers We need more regional-centric specialized consultancy firms with more Caribbean talent. We have Caribbean talent that can establish partnerships with international consultancy firms, just like Deloitte, establish partnerships with MDBs, with the philanthropic funds, with private sector, with academia, to crowd in local organizations, government agencies, and different entities, local entities, and work in developing not one project, but programs, pipelines of projects, and support that painful process of applying for climate finance. So let me leave it at that. I think everything else was very well said by my previous colleagues, but looking forward to hear Jade.
Awesome. Thank you for your insight, Anaitee. So jumping back to multilaterals, with all this in mind, Jade, how would you describe efforts made by multilateral development banks such as the World Bank, or where you work, the IDB, to address the climate emergency or looming climate threats in the Caribbean?
Good morning, and thank you, Jackson, to you and your team at Global Americans, and warm greetings to my fellow panelists and everybody who is online with us today. I will start on a very positive note in saying that we have seen great improvements and efforts from the MDBs towards the climate emergency. Climate is a cross-cutting team within all our projects across sectors, given its importance. So with that, we have seen more radical and targeted focus on climate in all of our work. The MDB scaled up mandates, targets, instruments, human capital, research, knowledge, and so on the topic. But with that said, we see a huge disproportionate distribution in our countries, and climate finance, as mentioned before, is not special in that regard. We see that across sectors in the Caribbean, we are underserved in the investment world. It is a structural challenge we are facing within the MDBs and the investment environment towards investing in our smaller, more riskier countries. And I'm hearing from my fellow panelists again, how much we rely on MDBs and the importance of MDBs within this. Again, we have seen good efforts, but the MDBs will really need to start walking the walk, as they say. And to be fair, there's a tough balance here with, on the one hand, MDBs have clear criteria for financing countries that are lower income. So the threshold of bringing affordable resources is linked to GDP per capita. And many of the vulnerable countries that are facing the enormous challenges of climate shocks, who are in need to boost their resilience infrastructure, for example, are considered middle-income countries. And even though they experience low growth, high debts, and they still fall outside the window pool of concessional resources because their GDP per capita is too high. And Marsha also spoke about this. And if we look at the side of the borrowers, and Lisa clearly outlined many of the challenges we have, we also need to beef up our fiscal sustainability frameworks and creating institutions readiness and do investments that clearly puts climate adaptation and mitigation investments as priority, while also ensuring that we take care of social needs. So it's definitely a complex approach that requires much stronger institutions. And that is why, more than ever, I think synergies between the sovereign side and the private sector side are very crucial. Within the IDB, we are working on new visions and new business models that are focused on the synergies needed to get that sustainable change and the growth that we need. The sovereign side needs to support and engage with the governments to develop and strengthen the law and regulations, as we've heard before, to enable the private sector to thrive and to attract other investors to invest in our countries. The MDBs are the bridge to help develop our markets in the Caribbean for this. We are now also in dialogue for a new value proposition of the IDB Invest, that's our private sector arm, in light of the deficiencies that we're talking about and also what we need in the future. The IDB Invest has had great growth. Before, we would have funds towards the small and island countries, which are 9 Caribbean countries within the IDB, for 50 million. And last year that was 727 million, which is 10.2% of their portfolio. And I think a big success factor to accomplish radical change is leadership on all ends. So real commitments from the sides of the government and also leadership from the sides of the MDBs. Because after all, it's also, the board of governors and the board of directors within the MDBs who need to approve these new mandates going forward. So from the side of the governments, we are seeing strong voices of our heads of states concerning this matter. And one of the most prominent voices is, as we all know, the Honorable Prime Minister Mihm, who also took it upon her to create this new initiative to take matters into her own hands, right? Very bold and exactly what we need now. And going back to the MDBs, this will go hand in hand with scaling up our technical assistance in our countries and the necessary human capital to support the growth that we are envisioning, and creating the right incentives within the institutions for our staff to conduct the necessary research and development of innovative instruments. Hiring staff on the ground in all our Caribbean countries was one of the main drivers for the exponential growth on the private sector side. We now have representation in all our Caribbean countries. So what we are also pushing for, and I think Anaitee also spoke about this, is more Caribbean presence in our institutions, who have the knowledge of our market and our specific climate issues. And as a specialist here have been saying, it is important, especially for the adaptation side of climate finance, because that's very specific, environmental specific, sector specific, where mitigation measures are easier to have a common strategy. I also just saw the opening speech at the IRENA conference, where again, the issue on the need for more clarity on policy and regulation was raised. And so I'm going to end with an example of an IDB Invest project that addresses this exact issue and demonstrates what the roles of the MDB should be, meaning doing market testing research to see where and what the need for adaptation projects are, country, sector specific in our countries. The IDB Invest has a current project in 3 of our Caribbean countries on climate change threats, to create a business case in order to ultimately be able to get other private sector investors in. So, we're able to create that track record. So over time, commercial banks and other investors are also able to chime in. I think I'm going to stop with that and following with, later with some of the real measures we can take. Thank you.
And that's a great place to pick up the next round of questions, which I would just want to encourage panelists to limit their responses a little bit so that we can get everyone to have a word in this next round. I want everyone to get 2 questions. But no, I think you left that at a great spot for Lisa because she has a great private sector perspective. So Lisa, we know that financial solutions that blend public and private investments are critical to advancing climate action. What type of innovative solutions are climate stressed countries using to attract the private sector in this regard?
Yes, well, there are a lot of innovative solutions out there that are being tried and tested. I think in the macroeconomic environment that I raised earlier, what's critical is reducing risk in order to attract investors. And so to that end, investors want to see more blended finance, loan guarantees, the type of support for multilateral development banks that can reduce risk on projects and make them attractive, even in the high interest rate environment that we're in. So the Bridgetown Initiative proposes essentially that multilateral development banks increase their lending and take on more risk, and that could help. In terms of insurance, we really have to rethink insurance, and insurance companies are starting to think that they need to more proactively invest in risk prevention and risk mitigation to increase the resilience of their clients. So not just waiting for something to happen and then making a payout, but starting to invest themselves and getting their clients to understand how they protect themselves against extreme weather events. There's expected to be more new insurance products coming out, more disaster relief financing, more parametric insurance, which pays out more quickly. It's tied to an event occurring. You don't have to wait as long to receive the payment. There's also a lot of interest in national and regional insurance funds like the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. This was created in 2007. At the time, it was the first multi-country risk pool in the world. So more pooling of insurance resources is another important financial tool. Also, businesses, as we discussed, private sector investment in resilience and adaptation is critical. And some businesses are investing in adaptation, especially the tourism industry in the Caribbean. So, for example, climate proofing hotels with solar water heaters or having backup generators or water storage. But it would help to work with financial institutions. If we could, have more work through financial institutions to help banks develop loan projects that can, pay for this type of investment. And the region has a strong banking sector, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago. So, there's a lot of local banks that can help this. And that can improve. They also need to improve data collection to be able to process those loan requests. And then carbon markets. We haven't talked about this, but it's a really interesting potential tool that we have. There's potential for Caribbean governments to sell carbon offsets, especially in voluntary carbon markets, through projects that reduce emissions, but can also have adaptation co-benefits. So regulated carbon markets like the ETS in Europe have very stringent requirements. So it's been difficult for Caribbean countries to structure projects that can actually be approved through that system. But voluntary carbon markets are a bit more flexible. And more, every day we hear more and more companies announcing that they have targets and strategies for reducing their emissions, and including, moving toward net zero. Well, for these companies to reach their net zero targets, in many cases, they're going to need to buy offsets. And they usually do that through the voluntary carbon market. So that's a whole new potential area for the Caribbean to tap into. I mean, there are a lot of challenges still with carbon markets, especially adaptation projects are small, so they usually have to be aggregated. There aren't enough intermediaries that identify them, can verify and monitor the projects. Often the value of the carbon offsets is too low to make a project viable. And there's just some lack of knowledge about how it works. But I do think with sort of more intermediaries helping to bring projects together and aggregate them, there could be a lot of finance from that. And then finally, blue bonds is a really interesting new area. Some countries have been able to offset part of their debt through the sale of blue bonds. And this allows them to offset some of the debt and then use some of the money for conservation efforts. So there have been two very interesting, exciting cases in Belize and in Barbados. And so I think that's a potential tool. So there's lots of new ideas out there that are starting to take shape.
No, thank you for that comprehensive overview. During your remarks, you mentioned financial institutions needing to do more. So I wanted to kick it to Jade and see kind of what were the main, in your opinion, the main constraints of the current international and regional financial architecture in scaling up climate finance.
Yes, some of the key constraints I would highlight are the current framework, the risk constraints, available data, regulations, and human capital. And I sometimes cringe when I hear the word, more innovation or, the constant search for all these new things. And where I think the Caribbean, the first thing we need to do is get the fundamentals right. Don't get me wrong, of course, we need tailored made instruments for our countries based on concrete research and data conducted in our countries. But we need to get the structure right to be able to implement all these initiatives. Once the whole international financing architecture is still focused on the current criteria that will channel concessional resources to countries that have low GDPs per capita, we will not really solve the problem, especially if you look at the example of the distribution of countries who are considered middle-high income by using criteria from before the 1950s. So the way forward really depends on initiatives like Bridgetown, in where Prime Minister Motley has been focused on more aggressive and systematic approaches to bring in financing to solve this in 2023. We are in a very different space right now, especially as the climate shocks are generated by countries, and Marsha also mentioned this, that are wealthier and have gotten to this point without observing environmental and climate-friendly standards. And those shocks are being felt by the same countries today that are being told that they cannot access financing because they are too risky. We had a presentation of multiple investors at IDB last week, and one of these investors said in very plain, concrete language, investors will not invest with a low return on investment even if the impact is significant. Like the current architecture just doesn't work that way. So that leaves what, 0 for the Caribbean. And we always hear the commercial banks, the other investors calling for the MDBs when it comes to the smaller, more riskier countries. You know, we do not have enough scale, the risks are too high, our projects are not bankable, and so on. So let's face it, like the investors want their bang for their buck. So we are kind of in a vicious cycle. And again, rightfully, that is why we need bold action like the Bridgetown Initiative that should surpass these constraints. And we need to go back to the fundamentals of the creation of multilaterals, back to global politics to show good to all humans. I mean, of course, fundamentally, multilateral development banks are banks. They're not donor agencies, they're not grant-making organizations. So unless a country or a company is able to pay them back, they're not going to give a loan. So there is a need to be a push by governments through the board of the MDBs towards more equity financing, more risky financing, and that they really act to the cause of what the mandate is. To bring this back, we are talking about humans here. You know, more studies, research, and investments are being done in other regions. Why? Because they have millions of people. So we are less sexy because, you know, we don't have a lot of people in the Caribbean. And MDBs cannot afford to say that a project is too risky or doesn't have enough scale, because why are we there then? So that is the reason of multilaterals. And as we know, the bold areas will not be covered by commercial banks. And Lisa also said it, and I think others, like the private sector, will need to step it up. They are now getting a lot of pressure internationally on emissions reductions, but as climate change gets worse, there's going to be more demand on adaptation products and services from them. And they also need to respond to the climate change adaptation and mitigation issues. And as the projects are not bankable right now, the public sector will take the lead. But I do expect that over time and over the next couple of years, the private sector is going to get more and more interested in this because it's becoming more and more pressing now. So the last thing I do want to say, because I do see the time, is to emphasize that we need to utilize the most important things of the MDBs, and that is the knowledge and experience we have within the MDBs. We really need to utilize that for our governments and also for the private sector.
No, thank you for, just sort of laying out the need for bold action. And kind of to follow up on that, it's been mentioned throughout the discussion and sort of alluded to, but I want to talk more about the the Bridgetown Initiative. As we all know, Barbados has become a global advocate for sustained climate action. So with an expert here, Marsha, I wanted to ask you if you could explain sort of the core idea behind the initiative, what's its current status, and what are sort of the follow-up steps, and how can we take bold action as an international community?
Okay, just that small matter to get to Jackson in a
Sorry.
Yeah, so first let me say that the Bridgetown Initiative is really the framing of ideas that we have been working through over some years. And we've been able, many of these were raised by the Barbados NAOSIS team in Glasgow at COP26. And then we were able to kind of package them based on discussions with other climate vulnerable countries to be able to present the Bridgetown Initiative. Now, I don't think it will be possible for me to go through every part of it, but to say that the core idea we've heard from many others on this call today, which is that the global financial architecture is insufficient. And the way that we positioned major institutions to be able to complete their mandate, which is provisioning to people so that they can improve their well-being and so that the planet survives, that somehow has become a bit lost behind the kind of bottom line targets that we've seen take over. What I do want to do with the conversation on the Bridgetown Initiative is to say that it calls for everyone to act at once together. And so what we've been doing is taking, at the Goal Center, one of the things that I'm working on now with the team is looking at parts of the Bridgetown Initiative that are asking questions that we need to answer. One of those questions is the use of special drawing rights. And how do we practically convert this reserve asset into a spendable cash? How do we encash SDRs so that governments and the private sector can spend, so that governments can spend, but also perhaps that we can on-lend through multilateral development banks? Now that takes a lot of work to do. We have to have conversations with central banks, some of whom need to change their legislation to make sure that SDRs are available. We have to look at the issue of who are the holders of SDRs. We are in constant discussions with the IMF on how can we make this instrument kind of more palatable for the objectives that we have. So I do want to say that the Bridgetown Initiative is a set of objectives, but behind each of those is the understanding that there's work that is ongoing that we have to do and questions that we have to answer. I also want to say that the important thing that we have to focus on is off-balance sheet investment for governments. Debt is an issue. And one of the reasons that the Bridgetown Initiative came together is that we've been saying for years that the climate conversation is taking place outside of the debt conversation. When the pandemic hit, when the crisis hit, G20 leaders came up with this debt service suspension initiative that was to cover bilateral public debt, but it was only countries that were eligible for borrowing under IDA rules, that were eligible for the DSSI. So of these 20 countries with the most significant contraction of GDP during 2020 after the pandemic, only one was eligible for the debt service suspension initiative, meaning that those countries were able to stop paying interest on their debt to be able to redirect those resources to recovery. So what we really think, and the Bridgetown Initiative sets us out, is a new framing of debt service suspension, a new debt service suspension initiative that is relevant to how countries accumulated their debt. That's one of the factors as well that we're working on. And something else I wanted to touch on based on what something that Lisa said, and also Jade's intervention, has to do with the idea of MDBs taking on more risk. Again, this comes back to my point about going behind the curtain of the Bridgetown Initiative, to be able to answer some of the questions so that it is implementable. And that's the work that we're doing now. And we hope that others will get on board with the Barbados government, with the Goal Center and others to answer some of those questions. Now, the issue of MDBs taking on more risk is related to MDBs rating and how are MDBs considered by the rating agencies based on the investments that they're making. So another conversation has to be had with rating agencies. So the Bridgetown Initiative is telling us what? That we need governments to come on board to be able to, especially developed country governments, to adopt some of these targets. We need central banks. We need rating agencies. We need especially multilateral development banks. And I agree with Jade that the IDB and the IMF have been kind of first movers in being able to frame climate resilience well in terms of climate finance, and we need others to join. But finally, I want to say that this is an execution agenda, the Bridgetown Initiative. It's not just a set of ideas. It is us saying to the global financial community, join us, because everybody has a piece of the pie to take away and to work on. And so over the next few days and weeks, we continuing to have discussions. We're continuing to make tweets. We're continuing to look at some of the finer points of exactly how do we get this done. But there is momentum finally on this issue. I'm optimistic like Jade, and I look forward to working with all of you to continue this work.
Thank you for your insight, Marsha. That was a tall order of a question, and I think you did a great job in breaking it down. I think what I took out of it is that efforts need to be unified on multiple fronts. And just bringing it back to COP27, obviously Bridgetown Initiative was unveiled there. I wanted to ask Anaitee about the new loss and damage fund. My apologies, Marsha. I know you mentioned it earlier that you have strong opinions. Hopefully there aren't dissenting ones here, but I wanted to hear, generally speaking, how's it been perceived in Jamaica and maybe the broader Caribbean as well, if you have insights on that? And what hurdles do you see as we keep talking about implementation on this discussion? So what hurdles do you see for its implementation?
Well, another tall order of a question. I think there's a lot of unpack about the loss and damage agreement, and I even will encourage Global Americans to dedicate just a panel about that, because there's too much to talk about. But to put it, very simple and short, in the Caribbean, there's two words to describe our reaction outside of the halls of the United Nations. One is fear, and what does it mean? Does it mean that we are accepting the fact that we are going to keep on losing living livelihoods, that this is just going to get worse? Another word is historic, and I want to recognize the work, painful struggle of many experts in AOCs, in local governments that have been working in these negotiations for years to finally get into this agreement. So kudos to that people, to those ones that were in the front lines of that negotiation, because that was a battle. There's a lot to unpack about loss and damage agreements, and there's possibly many hurdles that will need to overcome before it gets fully established and implemented. But I'm going to focus perhaps on two. Obviously, there's capacity that needs to be embedded. There's issues about the foundation, what I call adaptive operational foundation, which basically translates into how the fund is going to be designed, and whether it's going to consider a top-down meets bottom-up approach, or bottom-up meets top-down approach. And in my view, in general, this fund needs to be driven by country data. And that means that one hurdle that countries in the Caribbean are going to have to overcome is to substantially work on data collection, on data management, on historically assessing loss and damage, having that data readily available, and working on baselines about comparisons versus the last 10 years, the last 20 years, combined with climate projections. That is something that countries need immediately to work on. So that is one hurdle. The other hurdle, and this is something that we need to learn from other climate funds, and there's a lot of lessons learned, but how to minimize multiple layers of approval and enhance access. We talk a lot about enhancing access, but what does that mean for loss and damage? So there's going to be a lot of what I would, estimate a lot of back and forth about those enhanced access, those agile access. How is that going to happen? And the harmonized processes and guidelines, because that's one of the issues about climate finance, that we have so many requirements and different sets of templates and this and that. What's going to happen with loss and damage that changes the game for that? If I can say something else, is finance. For loss and damage, size does matter. Period. I think it has to be big. It has to be allocated constantly, predictable, substantially. And it has to be the national financing vehicles that are going to mobilize that finance to the country need to be innovative, need to be flexible. So MDBs have a big role to play there. And then how are we going to use what already exists in our each country landscapes? And that resource mobilization, domestic resource mobilization has to include taxes and subsidy reform. And this is a very spiky subject for it's not elections friendly. So that is something that I think it would require a debate just to talk about it. And on the monitoring side, we need to understand what does it entail in integration with transparency processes, with monitoring, with quantifying, with assessing. The countries will need a lot of capacity support for that immediately, even before this fund gets fully established. Hopefully this year we will see that fully designed, but countries need to start working since yesterday on data management. That's all I can say for now.
No, thank you, Anaitee. Your suggestion is well received to have an individual panel on this topic. I wanted to give the last question to Kalim, who's been waiting patiently. So Kalim, assuming that the international financial system is changed and hopefully all the things that we've been talking about on this call, that funds could be robustly allocated to small island states, what projects would you foresee these states undergoing from a sustainable development perspective? And then broadly, what do you look for in this upcoming year?
Thanks, Jackson. Very quickly, I think going back to before we sort of get to the project specific level, nothing is going to happen unless the region deals with some of the weaknesses in the policy and institutional infrastructure, as several of us have mentioned previously. These policy supports, regulatory supports, regulatory modernization, especially on the mitigation front, the energy, clean energy front, are essential if we're going to talk about scaling up and deepening some of these project initiatives. So I think that has to be a fundamental precursor. Now, not to let that stymie other types of projects. In terms of how we select and prioritize projects in a broader sustainable development context, I think we have to think back through our first principles of high vulnerability, right, and high rewards for resilience building. Projects have to, the vulnerability to impact and then the degree to which different projects can build resilience is a function of societal resource asset exposure to the impacts and the sensitivity of the assets to these impacts and some of the unique impacts of the Caribbean region. And of course, then also a function of adaptation potential, resilience building potential for things like if the technology exists, if it's been tested, if it's been tested to scale and so on. So, based on those kinds of principles, there's a number of kinds of projects that countries and the region can prioritize. On the adaptation front, we have significant challenges in many countries, most recently on water resources, water scarcity. There's challenges regarding food and nutrient security. Of course, we live in a very heterogeneous region, so the priorities for adaptation projects in Haiti are not the same as in Trinidad and Tobago. But there's other things, in forestry, climate-resistant infrastructure, a number of things. I think what's a nice case study is the reality that at least on the energy and mitigation side, we have to be driving for utility scale renewable projects. I don't think there's any way around that. I think it was mentioned before, NDCs, yes, but also to add to that point, there's an economic argument in the Caribbean, given that we have a very minimal GHG emissions compared globally. But there's an economic argument because, as also mentioned, highly indebted Caribbean countries, coupled with the continuance of importation of fossil fuels, is not something that is sustainable in the long run, definitely not now. So as much as domestic utility scale renewables can be part of the picture ramped up very quickly, I think this has to be a priority for project finance. Now, the other question is also continues to be, how do we prioritize all of the number of projects that might be in the pipeline or being considered in the pipeline? I want to emphasize that national strategies, country strategies are important, all right? And negotiating that with donor expectations and priorities has to be a bigger part of the conversation, especially on the ground. I like the point that Anaitee brought up in Jamaica of this idea of integrated systemic risk assessment being implemented there. This is the approach that we have to take in sort of not making the climate risk isolated from economic risk and economic development and economic priorities, right? I think integrated systemic risk assessment is something that we need as a tool to continue to prioritize where this sort of limited climate finance can go and can be distributed, even as we try to sort of broaden the pie of climate finance, of course. And then I think very importantly is prioritizing projects that have the opportunity or the greatest potential to leverage additional financing. I think one of the points that Jade brought up just now was the carbon markets, for example. We, at least even on the mitigation side, clean energy projects have much more definitive carbon credit acceptance than, say, for example, credits from forest projects, right? So I think there's another argument there for, at least on the clean energy side, being able to leverage additional financing through these additional benefits. And of course, leveraging for additional financing depends on what successful pilots have worked in the region, what sort of indigenous types of approaches have worked and have been tailored and specified for our region as compared to somewhere else. Have we seen scaling up and deepening out potentials being realized on projects? And these are the places that we perhaps need to look. Not, of course, to get into the conversation about continuous pilots and continuous pilots. I think someone made an earlier point of moving away from the project by project approach to a more programmatic approach, which is I completely support. And I suppose lastly, I think from an investor perspective, project readiness continues to be a challenge. But to your question, Jackson, of what projects should be prioritized, well, projects that show a certain amount of project readiness and viability in the eyes of investors, based on the indicators and metrics that the investors are looking at. Defined implementation plans, schedules, budgets, timelines, strategies, feedback loops for evaluation, scale-up opportunities, and so on. And of course, along with the risk management. Lastly, sort of on the sustainable development front, I think we shouldn't forget in this sort of this sometimes very calculated discussion on financing and financing instruments and mechanisms and so on. That sustainable development is really about sort of the social and environmental impacts of the projects that we do select. And of course, we know that in our region, we have also, work to do on weaknesses, sometimes on the transparency and good governance front, accountability fronts. So I think those also are things that are important and will bring societal buy-in. So someone had also mentioned the political dimension and the input of politicians. I think sort of having those sort of ESG type values in projects that we prioritize helps along those political pathways to get support as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kalim. To wrap up, I want to issue a series of warm thank yous and provide more information on Global Americans. First and foremost, I wanted to thank our esteemed panel today for their time and insight. I think you guys did a great job, truly. Secondly, I wanted to thank all attendees for showing your interest in learning more on such a critical topic. Third, I want to thank OSF for their generous support of our climate change in the Caribbean project, of which Ms. Lisa Viscidi, Dr. Kalim Shah, and Ms. Anaitee Mills are actually members. And then lastly, but not least, I want to thank the rest of the Global American staff for their help in preparing this discussion. If you want to learn more about Global Americans, I've put in the chat some links that might be interesting to you. The first is that of our Global Americans Climate Change in the Caribbean project. The next one is specifically the one on climate finance, where you'll see a lot of substantive high-level recommendations. The third is if you see a topic or heard about something that you would like to actually see in the discourse, is for article submissions. We accept those at Global Americans, and we'd love to shine a light in further detail on these topics that we touched on today. And finally, if you want to hear more about events like these, we have our newsletter where we announce and also publicize things like a YouTube video for events like these as well. So thank you to the panelists, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.